Chapter 5, Tissue Organization, Part 3. So, cartilage. We're moving on to cartilage, another kind of connective tissue. It is firm but semi-solid, kind of has a matrix that's kind of gelatinous or jelly-like. The mature cells in cartilage are called chondrocytes. Chondrocytes live in little open spaces called lacuna for one, lacunae for multiples. So chondrocytes live in lacunae. Cartilage is avascular, so it does not have blood vessels running through it, which means it heals slowly. And it occurs in areas of the body that need support and withstand deformation, withstand pressure being applied regularly. So, types of cartilage. We have hyaline cartilage, fibrocartilage, and elastic cartilage. Hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage is the most common type. Its chondrocytes are scattered about. You can see the nucleuses of the chondrocytes in red, and then that little line around them, that is not their plasma membrane. That is representing the lacuna. This is the space, the lacuna, where the chondrocyte lives. There are collagen fibers present in hyaline cartilage. You can't see it. They're not forming thick bundles, but collagen fibers are present. Outside of the hyaline cartilage is some dense irregular connective tissue called perichondrium. Perichondrium has blood vessels, so this provides the nutrients needed by the hyaline cartilage cells. Places you can find hyaline cartilage, it's at the costocartilage, that's the cartilage that connects the ribs to the sternum. Also at the articular ends of long bones, so where bones come together, there's usually a layer of hyaline cartilage. And then the fetal skeleton is composed primarily of hyaline cartilage that eventually gets turned into bone tissue. Fibrocartilage. Fibrocartilage is really good at resisting compression. Fibrocartilage has collagen fibers formed in thicker bundles, so we can see the wavy collagen fibers all throughout. Of course, we have the chondrocytes found within the lacuna. Not as much ground substance, more protein fibers. Fibrocartilage does not have perichondrium, so it heals extremely slowly. You can find fibrocartilage in the intervertebral discs, the discs between the vertebra, the pubic symphysis, that joint in the very front between the two hip bones where they connect, and the menisci of the knee joint. Elastic cartilage. Elastic cartilage has, surprise, surprise, elastic fibers. Those branchy fibers, you can see them all throughout here, branching out. It is very springy and flexible. This elastic cartilage has, again, the chondrocytes found in the lacuna, and it's able to resist changes in its shape, and if it is stretched, it can return to its normal shape. It is surrounded by the perichondrium, where the blood vessels will be. Locations include the external ear, the rigid, tougher part of your outer ear, and the epiglottis. Bone. Bone makes up the solid tissue of the connective tissues. It has great support, but it is not very flexible. You can't bend and squish bones that much, at least not without breaking them. Bone has both organic components, the collagen fibers and glycoproteins in the ground substance, and it also has inorganic components, the calcium salts that make it very hard. And bone is surrounded by dense irregular connective tissue in a structure called the periosteum that does bring blood vessels to bone tissue, but it turns out bone tissue also has lots of blood vessels within it. Bone tissue is vascular. Two types of bone tissue, compact and spongy. Bones have important functions. Bones act as levers for movement so that we can move the limbs of our bodies. They provide support for other tissues, protect vital organs. The skull protects the brain, and so on. The bone stores minerals, specifically calcium and phosphorus. It is calcium salts again that make the bones solid and hard. And also within bones are cells, hemopoietic cells, that make all of our blood cells. All of our blood cells are made in red bone marrow. Compact bone is relatively dense. It comes in reoccurring concentric circle structures called osteons. So it has these tree ring-like structures all throughout compact bone. In the very center of the osteon is an open space called the central canal, where you'll find blood vessels and nerves. Each layer, each ring of those concentric circles forming the osteon, those layers are called lamellae. Lamella for one, lamellae for many. And of course, the dark spots here are the lacuna, and within the lacuna is where we find the osteocytes. Spongy bone, on the other hand, is not as dense. It's more spread out, forming girders that stretch throughout the bone. Or a latticework structure, if you like that better. Because it's not as dense, they are lightweight, but still very, very strong. And spongy bone does not have osteons. Instead, their little branches are referred to as trabeculae. They do have lamellae, those layers of bone tissue, and the lacuna, where you find the osteocyte. Blood. Blood is the liquid connective tissue, connects the whole body. Its ground substance is called plasma. Plasma has lots of dissolved proteins and nutrients and wastes and hormones and heat, but no protein fibers. The cells found in the blood include the erythrocytes, the red blood cells that carry oxygen, the leukocytes, the white blood cells that have important immune response functions, and the teeny tiny platelets that aid in blood clotting. So, connective tissue, very diverse, found all over the body, and extremely important. All right, organs. What makes something an organ? Well, an organ is a structure with two or more tissue types, and those tissue types are going to work together to perform some complicated function. So two or more tissues make an organ. Turns out the stomach, you can see all four kinds of tissues. So here is a cross section of the wall of the stomach. Stomach, again, is a hollow organ, so it has an open space. So on its surface, on the inside, is epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue, simple columnar epithelium. And it is a type of mucous membrane, so it produces mucus. It also has, underneath that, of course, dense irregular connective tissue, holding the epithelial tissue to the underlying muscle tissues. In the dense irregular connective tissue, lots of nerves, lots of blood vessels, very important. Under that, we have 3 layers of smooth muscle tissue, very important to allow the stomach to churn its contents and then move it on to the intestines. And then finally, at the surface is areolar connective tissue. And finally, some simple squamous epithelium in the serous membrane that helps to surround the stomach. So again, all 4 kinds of tissues, connective, epithelial, muscular, and nervous. Membranes, body membranes. Body membranes are formed from an epithelial tissue bound to a connective tissue. Again, they're lining cavities. So they line the body cavities, line the surface of the body, the external surface of the body, and they also can be a covering for organs, viscera, internal organs. Four main kinds: mucosa, mucosis, serose, mucosa, cutaneous, and synovial. Don't know why I'm having trouble saying mucose. Mucous membrane, mucous membrane lines the openings to internal environments, so inside the esophagus, inside the mouth, basically where you have moist lining inside of the body. And surprise, surprise, it produces mucus, hence the name mucous membrane. It has absorption functions, protective functions, secretory functions. They can release things, absorb things, protect against invasion. And underneath them is connective tissue that attaches the epithelial tissue to underlying structures. So mucous membrane lining places like inside the oral cavity. Serous membranes. We know of 4 serous membranes. They do line body cavities that do not open to an external environment. So this is the inside of the serous membrane. There's that little space filled with fluid. The epithelial tissue is usually simple squamous epithelium. Underneath that, some loose connective tissue. They form a thin mount of serous fluid. And again, they form structures around the lungs, pleural membranes, around the heart, pericardium, or around abdominal organs, peritoneum. And they reduce friction, which is very important because all those organs are moving. We don't want them damaged from all that movement. Cutaneous membrane is the skin. It obviously is on the external surface of our body. The epithelial tissue is keratinized, stratified squamous epithelium. Underneath that is the dermis, which is many different kinds of connective tissue. Very important for protecting organs even deeper in our body, prevent water loss, prevent abrasions, damage from heat and chemicals. Very, very important. And finally, synovial membranes. Synovial membranes line synovial joints where movement occurs. Usually there's areolar connective tissue attached to simple squamous epithelial cells that will then produce fluid, synovial fluid in the cavity in the space. There's no basement membrane, which is odd. Probably the only example of epithelial tissue not using the basement membrane to connect to the connective tissue. And the importance is the synovial fluid that fills those cavities in between the moving joints, reduces frictions so that our joints are not wearing down as we use them. Tissue modifications. Tissues can change. Metaplasia is when mature epithelial tissue transitions to another kind of epithelial tissue because of environmental exposure, usually negative things happening. So for instance, in smokers, the epithelial cells, those ciliated pseudostratified columnar cells are going to transition into ciliated columnar epithelial cells, which then transition into non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. So the damage by the tar, the toxins, the heat in the smoke that smokers are breathing in will slowly turn the lining of their trachea from healthy ciliated mucus-producing tissue to non-ciliated, non-mucus-producing tissue, and basically make it more difficult to breathe. Hypertrophy. Hypertrophy is when, for some reason, the existing cells get bigger. So, for instance, if the heart is working way harder than it needs to move blood, it can become hypertrophic, become thicker, bigger than it needs to be. Hyperplasia is an increase in the number of cells. So, for instance, calluses, we produce a lot more of the epithelial cells from the epidermis to help provide additional protection to those areas being utilized. Neoplasia, we kind of talked about that already. Cancer, tumors, uncontrolled abnormal tissue growth. And then, of course, atrophy. Atrophying is getting smaller, a decrease in the number of cells and a decrease in the size of the cells. Can result from normal aging, can be because of organ failure, could be because someone is bedridden, or maybe they suffered paralysis and don't use those muscles as much. So atrophy can occur in muscle tissue, but also other tissues. So muscle tissues from disuse, cells become smaller, lose some cells, can be reversed by physical therapy to a point. So atrophying, if it's temporary, reason why it's happening, person can recover from it. Atrophied muscle, regular muscle. Necrosis is tissue death, and the tissue is irreversibly damaged. Could be an inflammatory response, could be an infection, could be burns, could be lots of things. And it can lead to infections like gangrene. Tissues. Our tissues also change as we get older, and not in a good way. So the support, maintenance, and replacement of cells and extracellular matrix becomes less efficient as we become older. So after middle age, when somebody becomes elderly, they just produce less proteins, produce less cells. So there's less production to replace materials. So things become thinner and more fragile. The structural and chemical compositions of the tissues are altered. Epithelial tissues become thinner. Connective tissues lose their pliability, their resilience, leading to things like wrinkling. Decline in the amount of protein, collagen fibers produced, delay in tissue repair slowed down, bones become brittle, nervous and muscular tissue begin to atrophy. Things become thinner, more fragile, less functional as you become elderly. And that is it for Chapter 5.